I have a Christmas tree that won't die. When I was growing up, my sister Sarah insisted we needed to have a real tree every Christmas, even though our household budget was literally less than zero most months. She would go absolutely all out in making Christmas fun and exciting, even when we were kids, artfully decorating the house with handmade ornaments and cutting lawns all year so she could afford to make dozens of gingerbread cookies when December came around. My favorite childhood memories were pine-scented and trimmed in tinsel, ringing with my grandmother's awful singing voice, my sister's happy laughter, and the crackling of the fireplace. But the year I turned 11, my grandmother passed away a few weeks before Christmas. Sarah and I had adored Graham, and we both felt like we were totally unmoored without her. At 19, Sarah was practically still a kid herself, but she was dead set on keeping me out of the foster care mess she went through. While I was a baby, she had spent a few years moving between families before my grandmother finally got custody of us both. Sarah didn't like to talk about it, but I knew with absolute certainty how fierce her love was for me, and that she would throw herself in front of a train rather than lose me. Sarah was a wild teenager, and her grandmother was constantly chasing after her. Graham hadn't liked Sarah's boyfriend, Mark, at all. Before she passed, Graham had frequently tried to convince Sarah that she really shouldn't be dating a man 10 years her senior, and especially not someone with such a volatile temper. I didn't learn about this until Sarah told me when I was much older, because I had never known either of my parents, but my biological father had been like Mark. He had sucked my mother into a whirlpool of all the things that ruin a young woman's life before she even graduated high school. By the time I was 6 months old, my father and my mother had both passed from overdoses within a year of each other. I knew Graham was perpetually afraid that what happened to her daughter would happen to Sarah and me, too. If it was possible, I liked Sarah's boyfriend even less than our grandmother did, with that kind of instant, unadulterated hate that kids have. I hated that he stole away my sister's time, I hated how he always smelled like cigarettes and cheap cologne, and I really hated all the times I had heard her crying on the phone with him. If Graham hadn't died, I think Sarah might have broken it off with Mark. He was an unsupportive asshole when she was sick, whining about how much time Sarah spent taking care of Graham and me, not even bothering to make sure Graham and I were out of earshot when he complained. But Graham had racked up so much medical debt from the cancer treatments that we lost our house only a few weeks after our funeral. So Sarah, Mark, and I were crammed together into a one-bedroom apartment, and my room was a tent of sheets hung with a clothesline and the living room couch for a bed. My sister scoured the classifieds for a second job and artfully dodged house visits from social services until we could afford something bigger. I spent every night rolling tiny balls of tissue to put into my ears, so I didn't hear her and Mark arguing about it through the thin walls, with him complaining about how he never signed up to take care of a freaking brat, and especially not two. I was less than thrilled about sharing my tiny space with a Christmas tree, but my sister was trying extra hard to make our first Christmas without Graham special. Mark had doubled her share of the rent because of me, and she had no savings to go to a proper tree lot. Mark made pretty good money in a union construction job, and I had heard her quietly begging him to just let her slide a little in December. But he was adamant that she had to cover all of her own expenses and mine, her beloved Christmas decorating being chief among them. A few beers in after work one day, Mark suggested we drive out into the local state park and cut down a tree ourselves. My sister protested that it wasn't safe, that we would get in a lot of trouble if we got caught, and although she didn't say it out loud to him, I saw her gaze kept darting to the quickly disappearing six-pack. He waved her off, and we reluctantly piled into his old Buick, me still in my pajamas with a hastily thrown-on winter coat because of the late hour. I remember that cold December night with crystalline clarity. There was a quiet crunch of frost beneath our boots, and my heart was pounding with worry that a police officer or park ranger might jump out from behind a tree trunk and catch us. My nose was running from the bitter cold, and I kept involuntarily sniffling, which annoyed Mark, who snapped at me every chance he got. Over the past weeks we had lived together, I got the impression that Mark hated me as much as I did him and was simultaneously obsessed with every little thing that I did. I would catch him staring at me in a way that made me want to talk to my sister, but I didn't know quite what to say, and I was petrified if he found out how much I disliked him, that he would throw us both to the curb. There was something incredibly unnerving about watching Mark walk around in the dark with a tree saw. I stayed as close as possible to my sister without knocking her over, my mittened hand clinging to hers tightly. Sarah squeezed my hand back just as hard, which made me wonder if she was equally as nervous about Mark's drunken laughter and uneven stride. We made our way deep into the forest, where no one would see us taking the tree down. The further out we went, the more the trees seemed to close in on us, as if they were banding together to intimidate us into going back. "How about this one?" Sarah had asked that question a few times before, her tone pleading, stopping in front of another tree. Mark blinked at her slowly and shook his head. It seemed as if he was turning this into a way to punish her for asking for something, as he so often did. Sarah clenched her free hand around a tree branch, looking at me worriedly. We walked until the moon hung high in the sky, wide and bright, like an eye watching us trek through the snow. My face went numb, my legs felt sore, and my eyes were heavy. I had fallen half asleep on my feet when Mark finally called out to Sarah and me, who had been trailing behind him for the last mile or so. "Here it is." His voice was full of faint cheer. He pulled a flask from his pocket and raised it to us before taking a celebratory swig. His cheeks were red with exertion, and his eyes were glassy and wild. "It's a little tall for the apartment, isn't it?" Sarah's voice was weary. She dropped my hand and put her mittens on her own cheeks to warm them. We had stopped in a clearing where the moon seemed to spotlight the tree Mark had picked. I had to admit it was the prettiest one I had seen so far, a lush, deep green and almost perfectly symmetrical. When Sarah shined the flashlight on it, the yellow beam made the frost that covered it glitter like it was already covered in golden tinsel. It stood about 1.5 feet higher than Mark. I tried to picture it in the small living room. "What do you think?" Mark's dark gaze was focused on me, the blade of the tree saw flickering sharply in the moonlight. I swallowed, feeling like a deer in the headlights, looking between him and my sister. Sarah saw the worry on my face. "We'll make it work." "Thank you, Mark." She answered for me, reaching for my hand again. He nodded, having gotten the answer he had obviously been looking for, and bent down to start sawing. I had never seen a tree cut down before. When Graham, Sarah, and I had picked them out in the lots over the years, they had already been neatly trimmed and packaged. I felt a pang of sharp guilt in my gut, like when I first realized that the chicken fingers at the store came from the same kind of chickens I saw at the petting zoo. Do trees know they're being cut down? I asked unthinkingly, looking at the looming tree line that circled the clearing where we stood. I felt like they were looking at us cut down their friend. "That's the stupidest freaking question I've heard in a long time," Mark grunted, the saw making a screech that sounded especially loud in the silent forest. Sarah ignored him and knelt to look me in the eye. "No, kiddo, they don't feel it," she said reassuringly, pulling my knit hat snugly over my ears while making a silly face to lighten the mood. I couldn't help but smile and wrap my arms around her in a warm hug. She returned the embrace almost too tightly. Over her shoulder, my gaze shifted to Mark. His face shone with sweat from the effort as he sawed diligently. Suddenly, something fell and bounced off his shoulder. Mark was startled by the impact, lifting an arm to block his face. I watched in horror as the saw blade ricocheted back, coming a hair's breadth away from his neck. I screamed, certain his throat would be slashed. Sarah whipped her neck around to see what had happened. Mark was staring at the half-sawed trunk, the blade still embedded and reverberating in the bark. Sarah leaped towards Mark to check on him, seeing the dangerous angle of the saw. The object that had hit him was just a pine cone. It rolled to a stop at my boot. I picked it up and examined it. "What the hell happened, Mark?" Sarah scanned the shadowed tree line anxiously, looking for what had caused the commotion. Her eyes landed on me, and I reflexively slid the pine cone into my pocket, like I might somehow get into trouble for holding it. My hand slipped. "No big deal," he said, trying to cover the fearful shaking in his voice. He got to his feet quickly and paced a few steps, taking deep breaths and another deep swig from his flask. "Should we just go home?" I heard Sarah ask him quietly. "No, we came all the way out here. Let's get your freaking tree." Mark snapped. He dropped to his knees and finished sawing through the tree, doubling his efforts in a fervor that seemed like angry retribution. Sarah led me out of the clearing to stand among the trees beyond, out of the area where the tree might fall. Mark kicked the tree to sever the last of the trunk, and it snapped with a sound like a gunshot, echoing through the trees and shaking the ground beneath us when it fell. Mark stood over it, panting like he had just won a battle. "All right," he said finally, "come help me carry it." Mark held the base of the trunk, Sarah stood at the front, and I reluctantly made my way to the center between them. Even at 11, I recognized the uncomfortable feeling that I was helping to do something wrong, like dragging away a body. The tree was heavy, and I could barely see my feet in front of me. I tripped and almost fell hard on my face, and Mark swore, readjusting his footing with the extra weight. "Pay attention." He growled at me, his face red and shiny with exertion. My arms were exhausted, but I was worried about what he might do if I faltered again. I looked at Sarah, but her concentration was entirely on the looming darkness before us and keeping the flashlight trained ahead. Suddenly, I felt something wrap around my wrists. I almost dropped my arms again, frightened, but another glance at Mark reminded me what might happen if I did. It was a prickling sensation, like tight rubber bracelets, but it wasn't painful. I kept my hands steady and found it easier to keep up with the pace of the adults who stood on either side of me. I was so relieved when we made it to the car I almost cried, my eyes welling up with tired tears. The prickling feeling around my wrists subsided when I freed my hands, and I scurried into the back seat, hugging myself to try to warm up and forget the strangeness of the night. I heard Mark and Sarah struggling to tie the tree to the top of the Buick, a scraping, metallic sound that made me feel like I was inside of a can opener. The ride back to the apartment was quiet and tense. Everyone was exhausted, and we still had to drag the tree inside and up the stairs. It was later than I had ever been awake before, and my eyes kept drifting shut. I woke to Sarah's gentle hand on my shoulder, the apartment building looming behind her. It was built like an old wooden ship, with drafty hallways that barely kept out the cold, short ceilings, no elevator system, and 7 flights of stairs. The lights inside were barely functional and flickered eerily in the tiny alcove that passed as a lobby. As we assembled back in formation to pick up the tree, standing in the cold entryway, my mind was awash with strange images and feelings, like we had walked inside of the tree and gotten stuck, or maybe never left the forest and would be carrying the corpse of the tree forever in the cold darkness. Once again, my wrists prickled as we walked up the stairs that led to the apartment. This time, I could see Sarah's face more clearly and saw the strain that wrinkled her forehead and tightened her jaw. I didn't dare look back at Mark. When we finally entered, Sarah immediately pulled out the tree stand, measuring it against the trunk. She had obviously been worried since she first raised her concerns with Mark, and her frown deepened. "It's going to be a tight fit," she said reluctantly. Mark, who had walked into the kitchen to take another beer from the fridge, slammed it down on the counter and grabbed the tree stand out of her hands. We had placed the tree horizontally on the threadbare living room carpet, and it occupied most of the room. Mark stood at the base of the tree trunk and started hammering it into the stand, using only his bare hands and fury. Sarah came and sat next to me on the couch that was also my bed, wrapping me up in my favorite old blanket, one that Graham had knitted for me and of the few things I had left from our old life. She held me and kissed the top of my head as Mark let out a stream of curses. "There," he finally said, having semi-successfully shoved the tree into the metal ring. Both the wood and the metal had warped, and there were splinters and pine needles everywhere. He hoisted it up, and the top of it bent under the ceiling. Even standing, it took up most of the free space in the room. He looked at Sarah and me and grabbed the trunk, shaking it like a prize fish. Mark's eyes suddenly widened, and he cursed loudly, yanking his hand away from the tree with a sudden jerk. Blood oozed profusely between his fingers. He cradled his mangled hand against his chest, his face contorted in pain. Sarah hesitated for a minute, her reluctance palpable before she finally, begrudgingly, rose to assist him. Something in there bit me. His accusatory, bloodshot eyes found mine, almost as if he blamed me. I thought about the prickling pressure around my wrists and twisted my hands together nervously, feeling overtired and confused about what was real. Sarah gave the branches a half-hearted shake, obviously doubting his perception. "I think you probably cut yourself while we were carrying it, or maybe on some of the splinters," Sarah tried to soothe him as she pulled him towards the bathroom. He looked wildly between me, Sarah, and the tree and seemed to realize how improbable his line of thought was, letting himself be pulled out of the living room. I was alone with the tree. Down the short hallway, I heard the familiar muffled sounds of Sarah's soothing murmurs and Mark's angry lamenting. I stared at the tree until my eyes grew too heavy to keep open, again struck by that odd feeling that I was still in the woods where we had found it. I slept fitfully, my dreams echoing the feelings that had haunted me while I was awake. I was back in the clearing, at the moment where the saw blade had almost hit Mark's neck. In the dream, however, black, gnarled tentacles that stretched like bird branches emerged from the tree, holding the blade to Mark's throat, dark blood dripping down to the ground like thick sap. Along the edges of the tree line, more black tendrils crept through the shadows, slithering closer and closer. I woke up with a start, feeling a phantom, rubbery pressure around my ankles. I was still sitting upright on the couch with my winter coat on, my blanket clenched in my hands. The tree seemed to take up my entire line of vision, and for a split second, I wondered if Mark had left me back in the forest and I had dreamed that I had made it back to the apartment. "Come and get your Pop-Tarts," Sarah called softly from the kitchen, and relief washed over me. I walked carefully past the tree and took my breakfast from my sister, a warm bundle wrapped in a paper towel. Sarah looked tired, still in her sweatpants, and her thick curls pulled back into a messy bun, but her wide smile lit up her face as usual. "Mark's still asleep, and we slept through your bus, so we're going to borrow the Buick to get you to school. Can you go get ready super fast?" she asked. I nodded, my mouth full of artificial strawberry filling, and sped through my morning routine. Sarah had a thoughtful look on her face as we drove to school. "Do you like living with me and Mark?" she asked suddenly. I faced the window, letting my breath fog the glass. "I like living with you," I answered carefully, with a tact I now know was way too advanced for an 11-year-old to have mastered. I think Sarah knew that then. In the reflection of the window, I watched her knuckles turn white as she gripped the steering wheel. We drove the rest of the way in silence until she parked in front of the school. "I can't wait to decorate the tree with you tonight." She pulled me into a hug before I left. "Me too." In truth, I didn't really want to touch the tree again, but I hoped my smile looked real. That week at school was tough. It was always hard in the weeks before Christmas, as Graham was always just barely scraping by, and my gift wish lists were always just a few lines where other kids wrote pages. That year, I didn't want to write down anything in case Sarah saw it and felt badly she couldn't afford to give me anything. Instead, when the teacher passed out the paper, I drew the forest from my dream, putting extra detail into the tree, hoping to solidify that I was truly back in reality by capturing it on the page. When I got off the bus outside of the old apartment building after school, I knew something was wrong. Sarah always waited for me to walk me from the bus stop, using her break between her shifts at the diner down the road. That day, I walked up the stairs to the apartment by myself, crunching on the dry pine needles we had left behind while dragging the tree the night before, full of dread for what I would find. When I opened the door, the side of the tree greeted me. A single strand of lights was wrapped around it, dangling like a tail, the rest lying in a tangle on the ground. Sarah sat in the same spot I had on the couch this morning, still in her pajamas instead of her work uniform, holding a bag of frozen peas against her chin. She saw me in the doorway and raised a hand in a wave, but her eyes were sad. I looked back at the tree, wondering if the strange magic it seemed to possess had gotten to her, too. "Ready to decorate?" she asked, her voice muffled by the bag. I stared at her, letting my backpack and coat slide to the floor next to the couch. She held my gaze and then slowly took the bag of peas away from her mouth, sighing like I was making her tell a secret. Her chin was a violent shade of purple, and dried blood was crusted around her lips. I stared at her, and she seemed to shrink into herself. "I tripped while I was taking out the ornaments," she said quietly. One of her handmade paper snowflakes was in her lap, and she smoothed it out and handed it to me. "Where should this one go?" She changed the subject. I took the snowflake from her, reeling from the 100 questions I had that ran through my mind. In a fog of worry I couldn't name, I looked around the tiny apartment and blindly found a spot on the wall. We repeated that a few more times until the air finally got lighter. She put on a soundtrack of classic Christmas carols and joined me in putting up the ornaments and decorations, although she didn't sing like usual, as her bruised mouth was still obviously painful.